Thank you. So, let me begin by thanking JNU Talks for inviting me. I am a regular speaker, Himanshu. I don't know how many times I've spoken from here. Pretty practiced. I'm scared of these things. Okay, thanks, Samim. Okay, so thank you, Professor Lal. I listened very carefully to things that you were saying, and let me begin by saying how dark are the times that we live in. They are so dark that there is no possibility in sight of them getting any better anytime soon. And I think it's on that very dark, ominous, pessimistic note that I must begin. And I'm sorry I always apologize to my students for having to say these things, because there is now a very strange impossibility in the world. And when things are very strange and when they are impossible, there's always something has to give. Something has to give way in terms of the intractability, in terms of the stalemate that we are witnessing right now. And I wonder what that thing is. It's very difficult for us to imagine the way in which the world will shape itself in the next few years. Forget the next few years. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow morning. The pace of change has become so rapid. Technology, of course, plays a very significant role in terms of this very rapid acceleration. But let me begin with something of an experience. You know, when I was growing up, when I was a child in the 1980s, I used to watch a lot of Second World War movies. And I would think, oh man, how cool must it have been to live in those days. Because the 1980s was a pretty dour kind of a decade. It was going to school, getting a career, getting a job and stuff like that. And I thought, if only times could be a little more interesting, exciting. Well, lo and behold, we are living through some of the most interesting times, some of the most uncertain times that we can think of. Now, this is where theorization in the social sciences becomes very important. As someone who teaches political theory or tries to teach political theory, I've always felt that political theory is written in those moments of acute crisis, when there is great uncertainty. It's not written from cushy academic positions. I've now completely given up on that particular view. Now, what worries me about the state of the world and the way that academia is responding to the state of the world is the sheer insularity and pedantry of academia. This is what really worries me. The way in which academics tend to bury their noses in books and think that the worries and the woes of the world will go away. They won't go away like that. I mean, I'm not for a minute advocating any anti-intellectuals, and I'm so glad that this is a JNU problem. I think this is a problem with universities all over the world. This name-dropping thing, you know, so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this. There's this famous Stoic teacher who once told his student, so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this and he said that and she said this and they said that. Fool, what is it that you have to say? And I think it is this aspect of academia that has become so problematic. And in order to respond to the uncertainty of the times, it is very, very important for political theory, especially the discipline that I teach. It is very important to be able to resonate with the times that we are living in terms of this. Now, what do I think is so problematic with the world? As I said, there's a strange impossibility, and it also gives me this feeling, especially in this country, and of course not just in this country, but in many, many other countries across the world, that we are woefully on the wrong side of history. And there is no better example than the Palestinian question, which of course you spoke on, because if I just look at that one issue, and I look at the absolutely shameless silence of Indian academia on this, it makes me very, very worried about what exactly is going on. I mean, people just cannot condemn. Remember October 7th? Every single time so many of us were asked, do you condemn, do you condemn? To the point that it became nauseating. So many organizations have now come out. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, has come out with a report. 2 Israeli human rights organizations have said it's a genocide. Navi Pillai, of the UN. She came out with a report last week. 4 out of 5 counts, Israel is committing genocide. But you know what? In all these bastions of free speech across the world, I especially have the UK in mind, you can't say the genocide word. I mean, doesn't that give us a sense of how absurd the world that we are living in is right now? There's something going on right in front of us. We see it live streamed in our devices. It makes me go crazy, actually. Every single day for the last 2 years. It's going to be 2 years in October. I remember giving a talk in SIS in November 2023, and I remember saying, if it speaks like a genocide, if it kills like a genocide, if it shows intent like a genocide, it is a genocide. And a lot of people saying, no, you can't say that too quickly, but here we are. Now, this is really what worries me about academia. The inability of academics to actually be able to call a genocidal spade a genocidal spade. And Indian academia is especially problematic in this sense. Now, I made this point about an insularity of Indian academia. And I think one reason for this insularity is this particular manner in which a certain indigeneity and a certain kind of obsession with indigeneity has taken over Indian academia, to the extent that there's no space for any cosmopolitanism left. Now, in many talks that I have often given, I've always made this distinction between an indigenous insularity, which I've always been against because I think it just implodes in on itself, and a certain rooted cosmopolitanism, which I think is open to the currents of the world, and which looks at the world. I don't find that element of a rooted cosmopolitanism. In fact, because of strands like post-colonial theory and decoloniality, what I see is a growing indigeneity in academia. Since you mentioned the cosmopolitanism before the British, let me quickly, for 3 or 4 minutes, talk about a particular figure that I have been very obsessed with because I've been recently written a paper on this particular man. A 19th century figure called Jamaluddin Afghani. He was from Iran, but called himself Afghani. Quite a mischief maker, as I've called him in my presentation that I made recently. But the most remarkable thing that when I read Jamaluddin Afghani's story is that he actually came to India in 1857. He was a young man. He would have been 18, 19 years old when he came to India, and the Great Indian Mutiny would have been on. That is what gives him a lifelong hatred of the British. He absolutely hates the British. He thinks that they are the major reason for all the problems in the world. He makes certain geopolitical assumptions which are flawed, but the man is characterized by this remarkable ability to travel. In fact, the paper that I've written is called The Pan-Islamic Peregrinations of Jamaluddin Afghani. He compares himself to a peregrine falcon, a bird that is able to achieve remarkable levels of speed when it is flying. So after his sojourn in India and after he goes to Afghanistan, he goes back to Iran, his native Iran. He's from a place called Asadabad, which is the Hamdan region of Iran. His father, like all fathers who tell their sons at a certain age, he tells him, you know, you're a young man, it's time for you to get married, settle down and start a family. And he says something remarkable. Okay, I'm going to say this in Urdu first and then translate this. He says that, this is the Urdu first, okay? He tells his father, you know, I'm not going to get married, which is no advice for people not to get married. Please do not think of it in that way. But he says, Dunya ki wusat bahut hai. Okay, the width and expanse of the world is very, very vast. But itni nahi hai ki jab main apne par phailaun to usko samale. But it is not enough for me when I spread my wings for it to be able to contain this. Now, in many ways, what Afghani is doing is that he's making this reference to the mythical Persian bird, the simurgh. Because Rudyard Kipling said that the east is the east and west is west and there where the twain shall meet. But in the idea of the simurgh, you have the idea of a bird that when it spreads its wings, it is able to cover the expanse between the Mashriq, which is the east, and the Maghrib, which is the west. Now, it is that spirit of cosmopolitanism, which I do not think we seem to have any appreciation of. Afghani was a remarkable figure. He spent his time in Istanbul, in Cairo, wherever he goes, he gets himself into trouble. The best story that I've heard about Afghani is when he goes to Moscow, and he's trying to get the attention of the Russian Tsar. The only way, and he was a completely non-practicing Muslim, he just used Islam as a kind of a solidarity. So the only way that he could get the attention of the Tsar is when the Tsar goes to the theater, and he books a seat right opposite the Tsar. And when it's time for prayers, he's like conspicuously looking at his watch, keeps looking at it. And when it's time for the prayers, he starts saying the azan out very loud and starts his prayers. Some people ask him, what exactly do you think you're doing? And he said, when my Lord above calls, no Lord on the earth can detain me from my prayers. And that's how he gets the attention of the Russian Tsar. But my point is that there is a particular kind of cosmopolitanism that I noticed in a 19th century figure. Now, what has completely eliminated the possibilities of this particular cosmopolitanism that Professor Lal, you referred to, and I'm referring to? I think it is the nation state. It is perhaps one of the most insular, one of the most isolated, one of the most contained political formations that we have seen in human history. Now, I've often made this point. There's a term that I've used in a number of talks that I've given, that the term that I grew up with before South Asia became fashionable in academic circles is the idea of the Bar-e-Saghir, which means the Indian subcontinent. It's an Urdu word which means the Indian subcontinent. Now, the Bar-e-Saghir contains, of course, India, and of course, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and Nepal, and Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, which was, of course, called Burma. Now, I'm going to kind of try to expand the idea of the cosmopolitans of this particular space, because it just doesn't end there. Because you mentioned the Persian Empire, and I am reminded of the famous Chicago historian Marshall Hodgson, who in his work, The Venture of Islam, talks about the three gunpowder empires. The Ottoman Empire here, we are sitting in the center of the former Mughal Empire. Then, of course, you have the Safavid Empire, which covers the expanse of Iran, and you have the Ottoman Empire, which extends all the way into Europe. Now, if one thinks of geographical, cultural, political expanses of this particular kind, one gets a sense of how confined, how restricted, how constrained is the nation state as an idea. Now, the problem with the nation state as I see it is that it has become I won't use any names. I won't drop any names, so-and-so said this. But the problem with the nation state is that it ends up super saturating the idea of nationalism within it. So I'm trying to make a difference between the nation state as a container that instantiates the diffuseness of nationalism as an idea, right? So nationalism is a diffuse idea, and it must be instantiated and contained in a particular idea. Now my point is that what has happened and made the nation state such a dangerous entity that it is right now is that it is brimming over. Labrez is Urdu mein kehte hain. If I try to fill up this bottle with too much water, it'll brim over. What I see is nationalism filling in the nation state and the nation state brimming over with this kind of a super saturation of nationalism. Now this is dangerous. It's dangerous because I'll have to drop this name because this is a very popular name. This is Zohran Mamdani's dad, and I'm a great fan of Zohran Mamdani. Mahmoud Mamdani, who in his book talks about the nation state as an essentially genocidal category. There is a potential for genocide. Now, when does the nation state become genocidal? The nation state becomes genocidal when this process that I just referred to happens, when there's a kind of a brimming over of nationalism in a nation state that cannot contain this supersaturation of nationalism. But most importantly, when a nation state weaponizes its sovereignty against its weakest. And this is exactly what we see in Palestine right now, in Israel. Israel can only exist without Palestine. I mean, Netanyahu has said that. He said there will be no Palestinian state. Anyone who talks about a two-state solution is a damn fool as far as I can understand. It's not going to happen. Okay? The recent recognition of the British, the Australians, the Canadians, I mean, is this a joke? This too little, too late recognition of a Palestinian state? Can this stop the people who are being killed and bombed every single day? Of course it won't. I don't know what it does. Is it solving their conscience? I don't know what it is doing, but what it is certainly not doing is preventing that particular violence from being stopped. Because the most important requirement right now is for that violence to stop. Now, I'm going to go through a series of points, whatever time I have left, so just let me know when my time gets over. Why have we reached this particular situation? We have reached this particular situation where we are right now because of the point about the nation state, I said, the nation state that is brimming over with this particular supersaturation of nationalism. But there's also something that Tariq Ali, no relative of mine, calls the extreme center. For far too long in the 80s and 90s, we were told that the center is a certain sensible middle ground. Okay? The famous Tony Blair third way, Bill Clinton and his social democracy. Now, the extreme center is just disappeared. The only thing that you have left right now is an extremely lunatic far right. And of course, we talked about Charlie Kirk a little while ago. And the whole Charlie Kirk assassination, everything that is happening in the US right now is a manifestation of the vanishing and disappearance of this extreme center. Now, what was the extreme center characterized by? I go back to Tariq Ali's book, 2015 book that he wrote. He says, well, it was characterized at its very core by a commitment to free markets, which I think is the other major thing that has resulted in the kind of problem that we are in right now. Every single politician who wanted to occupy political power had to sufficiently genuflect to the market in order to be able to come to power. And this is what many social democratic parties were told. They were told, okay, shelve your socialist agendas. I remember the British Labour Party, clause 4 of its constitution that linked it to the common ownership of resources and the working class was deleted. That was when the Labour Party really sold its soul. It was a Faustian bargain under Tony Blair. And look at where they are right now. So what I'm trying to kind of bring together is that the combination of a nation state that is saturated with a brimming over nationalism, an extreme center that must genuflect to the market, culminated in the year 2008, the year that I joined JNU, in the financial crisis. It all began from the subprime mortgage crisis. Now, what worried me as a young faculty member, it was a long time ago. I was young a long time ago. Now I've grown old now. I've grown right from being young to old now. The middle age is completely because of everything that is happening in the world. But what worried me was the fact that people were not talking about this because I had a feeling that this would have major global implications. You know what we were doing? We were celebrating our democracy around that time. We were celebrating democracy and selling Indian democracy as a flavor of the season. Now this is what really worries me about Indian academia. The insularity in Indian academia, I think, comes from an insularity of its own exceptionality. The idea, we just get it right. Kuch hai. Something we can do better than. No, India is no exceptionality to the world. So what did the financial crisis result in? It resulted in one of the cruelest measures on the working class, austerity. It's one of the biggest misnomers that I've ever heard. When I was growing up, I thought, oh, Gandhi is austere. But austerity, these cruel measures that are imposed on an already austere working class, has made the lives of the working class so difficult. And I go to Professor Lal's point about identity so completely taking over and eliminating the working class concerns that were a very important part of this university and every single left-wing university across the world. So what did we have? We had the rise of authoritarian right-wing populism. We're familiar with that in this country. You're familiar with that in the US. In the UK, you think of Orban's Hungary. I mean, you name it. Every single country has been completely engulfed by this particular madness of populism. Now, what does it do? Well, basically, in the way that I understand populism is that it is characterized by creating a certain hatred of elites. But it doesn't eliminate elites. It replaces a bad elite with a much worse elite. So it's like that old English saying, out of the frying pan and into the fire, because this is exactly what is happening right now. Now, I talked about the impossibility of the world. Now, the impossibility of the world was compounded by the 2008 financial crisis. It was compounded by right-wing authoritarian populism, which we are suffering for a good over a decade now. It was compounded by, in 2016, Mr. Trump came to power, first term. Brexit happened. We had 2 years of our own government here, which shows no signs of ending. But for me, that year represented how things were likely to get worse. And then what would we have? 4 years later, we had the pandemic. And to me, the pandemic convinced me about this impossibility in the world. That there was a crisis that politics was just not willing to address. In fact, what the pandemic gave us was greater levels of electronic surveillance, greater levels of electronic authoritarianism. So it resulted, I mean, the autocrats and the dictators were able to reinforce themselves. Let me come to 2 years after that, the Ukraine crisis, the so-called special military operations in Ukraine. Now, what worried me about the response of the Indian left to the Ukraine crisis was exactly like the BJP. Okay, this siding with Russia. Of course, the Ukraine crisis was a result of NATO expansionism. I'm not for a minute denying that at all. But what you had was the authoritarianism of Putin and the particular kind of nationalism that inspires him, wanting to just kind of rush into Ukraine and say, oh, this is all mine. And in 2014, he did in Crimea, and this was the fag end of the Obama years. Obama couldn't do anything about it. So increasingly, what I have, the feeling, or the nasty feeling that I've had, is that we are entering an era of major global change. And whenever global change happens, it doesn't happen without turbulence. And this is the kind of turbulence that we are witnessing right now. So when the Ukraine crisis happened, I remember when I got the news, a friend of mine called me and said, what does it feel like? I said, well, this is perhaps what it may have felt like on the 1st of September 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. Because what we are seeing is, it's all a crisis of the nation state, right? Ukraine is a crisis of the nation state. Russia and Russian nationalism. Pashtunarnost is the Russian word that captures the kind of nationalism that inspires Vladimir Putin. So it's precisely this particular problem of the nation state not being able to solve any of the problems that you pointed. Climate change, can it solve it? Of course it can't. Artificial intelligence, you combine these two, what do we have? We have a major, and it's a big word to use, but let me use it on this. We have an existential crisis on our hands right now. This is the time to think on a planetary scale, not in terms of the confines of the nation state. So let me come to where we stand. Final 2 points that I want to make. As I said a little while ago, we are, especially in India, woefully on the wrong side of history. Now, some months ago, someone, a student, a very bright student, asked me, how do you identify the right side of history? And I said, let's come up with a rule of thumb. The right side of history tends to be the side of the bread that is not buttered. That is not buttered with flattery towards power. And what we need right now is perhaps the most importantly, to be able to speak that vital truth to power, which so many of us are so scared to do right now. But when times demand this, it's important. Now, how do we do that? How do people speak truth to power? It's an old Socratic idea. And I have one simple suggestion. A lot of my friends ask me, I write a lot on Palestine, I speak a lot on Palestine. If there is anything in my middle-aged existence that has really troubled me, it is this issue. And whenever my mother is here, she'll ask me, "Tumhare kehne se kya hoga aisa?" Okay, you write about it. And I said, "Kuch nahi hoga." But at least the one thing that I could do is to condemn the wrong and commend the right. I do really, especially for young people, recommend this as a rule of thumb, to be able to be on the right side of history. Let me say this once again. To be able to commend the right and condemn the wrong. This is one of the ways in which we can perhaps start to wriggle ourselves out of this almost impossible situation that we are in. I am a political scientist. I am a great believer in what I often in class call the possibilities of the political. In the most impossible circumstances, when people get together and decide, this is the way we want to live, those possibilities can open up. And therefore, especially for young people, I know that it's a hot, humid September afternoon. It is September, right? I haven't got one. Yeah. This is one of those things that I think is very important. This is not about high-flown intellectualism. It is not about sounding off how many books you've read, who says what on page 5 of a book and page 7 contradicts himself. You know, that's the kind of pedantry of political theory that it riles me up. But this is really where we are right now. I'm reminded of a point that Malcolm X made in his famous 1964 address, a few months before he was assassinated. He was assassinated in February 1965. I think in November 1964, a year after Kennedy's assassination, he went to the Oxford Union. And he debated the motion, moderation is no virtue in the pursuit of justice. There can be no moderation in the pursuit of justice. That's what I would like to end. Thank you so much.